Hello, everyone. This is Dan Libenson, and I'm here with Denise Handlarski for another episode of the show that we call Daring Judaism, which, by the way, I made a placeholder graphic for that's now on our website, but we're going to get a more professional one soon. Anyway, so Denise, welcome back. It's great to be with you again this week.
And you, always nice to talk to you.
And you can see over my shoulder here that one of the topics that we're going to talk about is Denise's book, called The A to Z of Intermarriage. And that's why my background is different from usual. And we're very excited to talk about that. So I think that we wanted to start, actually, I guess we talked about starting with wishing everybody happy Mimuna. And some people may not know what that means. And we actually aren't 100% sure that it actually is Mimuna today, as opposed to last night only. Something probably we should have researched before the show, but we only thought about it as we were talking in the last few minutes. So Denise, you want to tell people a little bit about what that means, happy Mimuna?
Sure. So hi, everybody. Nice to be with you as we lead into Shabbat. So Mimuna is a holiday that comes at the end of Passover. So as many people likely know, Passover, well, actually, there's debate over whether it should be 7 days or 8 days. Many people, would call it an 8-day festival, sort of similar to Hanukkah or Sukkot. And Mimuna comes at the end of it. It's traditionally celebrated by Moroccan Jews, and then became something that many other Sephardi Jews or even a lot of people in Israel celebrate. And we know it to be a sort of evening festival that ends with, a lovely dinner, and there are special traditions. And I just want to sort of acknowledge that the reason Dan and I don't know that much about it is because not only are we both Jews who didn't grow up with that tradition, but also in the North American context, we live in a sort of Ashkenormative world, or a world in which we are more likely to know the Ashkenazi customs. And so, I sort of apologize for my lack of knowledge, and I don't want to talk too much about something that I've never marked myself, but I do think it's important to wish people who do celebrate a very happy festival, a good holiday, and to note that this is a beautiful practice that many Jews around the world do mark.
Yeah, and we talked about, sometimes it's hard to know, especially these days, it's hard for me to know exactly where's the line, or where do people think the line is, and or where should the line be between, adopting or adapting practices from other cultures, even a sort of subculture of one's own culture, versus what is cultural appropriation. I actually, maybe something that we could discuss sometime. I was playing around after I saw the movie Coco. I was really inspired by it, and I really felt like we should have a Jewish Day of the Dead, and that even though Judaism is pretty good in many ways at grief and mourning and all that, that the idea of a Day of the Dead where we really was more celebratory, that really appealed to me. And I started to play around a little bit with what I was calling, the Hebrew Yom HaMetim, which means Day of the Dead in Hebrew. And I did a little, adaptation. And I don't know if that's, okay or not. I mean, it felt okay to me. It feels to me like Judaism is mostly borrowed from other cultures. And so how do we really think about that? I mean, it's a complex topic. But with Mimuna, we were actually thinking about, when Lex and I were talking on the Judaism Unbound podcast a few weeks ago, we were talking about the idea of reimagining Passover to try to work better. This was actually before the coronavirus stuff, that actually there was this feeling that Passover we weren't quite experiencing Passover the way that maybe we could, where it really was a transforming type of experience, where somehow, I mean, my understanding of Passover is that what you're supposed to do is actually almost become it changes you. You become a person who actually was a slave and actually was freed, because there's some theory that if you actually went through this experience, you would conduct yourself differently in the world. You would have more empathy towards those who are enslaved today, or who are oppressed today, etc. And my feeling was like, we're not really accomplishing that too well at the Seder. I don't know too many people. In fact, I've done this study with like college students, including, from the very Orthodox to the very non practicing at all, kind of thing. And nobody has ever said to me that they have an experience at the Passover Seder where they feel transformed. And so I was like, well, I don't think we're getting this right. So one of the theories was, could we maybe have, instead of having two Seders, the first night and the second night, could we actually have two Seders basically on the first night and the ninth night, basically the end of Passover, or, if you only celebrate 7 days, then the eighth night. And that would basically be Mimuna. And Mimuna is a celebratory kind of, I think that the celebration is more about now we can eat bread. Now we don't have to, it's not Passover anymore. No, I mean, I think that that's what they're actually celebrating, but like, what if instead we sort of adapted that and said the celebration is that we were freed from slavery. And so then the Passover, the whole 7 or 8 days becomes this time when we almost reenact slavery. So we should try to suffer even more. I think in the COVID-19 era, that part of why this fell by the wayside was because we were already suffering plenty.
No need to add suffering.
Right. So it didn't feel quite right to actually try this year, so I didn't. But I do like the idea that the first night of Passover, the first Seder would be more about the slavery part than about the freedom part. And we would kind of spend the next 7 days kind of, living a more, what do you call it? Like a more, a less rich life, a kind of a more ascetic type of life or something like that. And then on the 8th day, it would be a release. And that would be actually the part of the Seder, would be moved over to there. That's the more celebratory, the Hallel, whatever it might be, the singing, and that would be, and so then Mimuna, everybody would celebrate some version of Mimuna. But instead of just being that we're celebrating now we can eat bread, it's also that we would maybe make a public declaration that now we will fight oppression for the rest of the year, or something along those lines. So I think, I mean, I don't know, like, that's my question of like, where's the line between appropriate and inappropriate in sort of taking a festival that really isn't natively yours and saying, but I'm inspired by it. And I think, right. So that's a question that I have.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so much of what we call Judaism was borrowed from other cultures. So if we're really against cultural appropriation, we can't have things like dreidels.
Right.
But, and I think a lot of us see that as just such a Jewish thing. So adaptation is very much part of our culture, but there's also a way in which now we do know more about it. And I do think we want to be sensitive. I would feel strange celebrating Mimuna just with my family. I would love to celebrate it with people for whom that's their tradition.
Yeah. And by the way, maybe like the adaptation version wouldn't be called Mimuna, or certainly not if the Moroccan Jews objected, but I mean, I think it's sort of inspired by, but I guess I'm sort of saying, I just want to call it Passover, like that Passover becomes redefined as having a Seder on both ends, or something.
Adapt the whole thing.
Right? But yeah, well, anybody who, celebrates Mimuna, we would love to know what you think about that. Actually, maybe that leads us a little bit into talking about the subject of your book, which I, have the book jacket here in back of me. It's called The A to Z of Intermarriage. And it's actually constructed as kind of like, I guess, an encyclopedia, in the sense that it's alphabetical. And I mean, it looks like encyclopedia entries is my point, as opposed to it's a narrative, it's a story, it's a nonfiction, essays collection. I mean, it's short essays in the form of alphabetical listings of various topics that relate to intermarriage, and which I think is a great way to organize it. Very, very fun, very informative. So, I guess the question is, the question that relates to this, what we were just talking about with Mimuna, is like, how does it work, in terms of when one is married to somebody from a different culture, a different religion? It would be natural that practices tend to be traded, fused, borrowed from, and I mean, we don't have to talk about that specifically right now, but that's the connection that I'm making to the Mimuna thing. So maybe let's just start. I mean, I guess, could you tell us a little bit about your book and, when it came out and what it's all about?
I would love to tell you. So the book actually launched in March, which turned out to be a sad time to launch a book, because the book launch was canceled, the book tour was canceled. We're sort of a little bit in flux with the book. But it is for people who are intermarried, or, one of the things I talk about in the book is the word intermarriage is kind of complicated. Not everybody's married. You might be in a long-term partnership, and the same things apply.
Right.
And there's also the word inter is a little bit confusing. A lot of people talk about interfaith, but we do this show talking about secular and cultural Judaism. So a lot of people don't see themselves as faith people.
Right.
So it's sort of intercultural, or in some ways you grew up with different cultures, and that could actually be Ashkenazi and Sephardic, where maybe that's the intermarriage. So I think expansively in the book about what intermarriage is. And one of the things I say is that, in a sense, all marriages are intermarriages, because if I had married a conservative Jew, that would have been much more difficult in terms of negotiating what our home life looks like and where we go to services and stuff,
right,
than me marrying somebody, which I did. I'm intermarried myself. So my partner is, an atheist who celebrates Christmas with a dinner, and it's very easy to, do Judaism the way I like to do it, and we celebrate his things in a cultural way. It doesn't feel like a
right.
conflict.
By the way, I'm also intermarried because I am married to a Jew from the South, and I'm from the North. So
there you are.
Everybody's intermarried.
As
like
a Canadian, I don't understand those regional differences, maybe with the same nuance that you do, but I get it. And actually, just as you were talking about, I was thinking about somebody posted on Instagram. I didn't note the person's name, but with the hashtag intermarriage, she said, I want you to know that as a Latina married to a Jewish person, giving up rice for 8 days is a sure sign of our commitment. And so right. It works in all kinds of ways. And those are the people that the book is for, as well as people. It's also sort of addressing people who might have somebody intermarrying in their family, like if you're the parent of an adult child who's intermarrying, or an intercultural partnership. So I think that almost all families are touched by intermarriage. And so it could be for anybody, particularly if there have been conversations that are difficult to resolve. So it's meant to be a little bit of a how-to. Not that I tell you what to do, but I share lots of stories from couples I've married and worked with in terms of how they do it. And I share stories from my life in terms of how we've done it, just to give examples. And yeah, the alphabetical nature means you can flip to, if you're like, oh, how do we deal with, maybe we never thought about how to deal with, since you were talking about Day of the Dead, like, somebody in our family has died. How do we handle that as an intermarried family? Or how do we plan for our own deaths? Is there a place we can be buried together? Or whatever it is that we would choose. So you can flip to like D for death. You can flip to C for circumcision. You can flip to the Chrismica section. Whatever it is you're looking for, it made it easy to find. But it's also, I do think, kind of fun to read all the way through, because some of the things build on each other.
Is that why you did it in the alphabetical way? Like, because it generally, or it often is the case that someone has a very specific issue that's arisen?
Yeah, I wanted it to be that you could choose to read it all the way through, or you could flip around and it would still make sense. So I didn't want it to be that if you just want to get certain advice or perspective on something, then you would have to read through the whole thing to get there. But yeah, so that's why it's alphabetical. I do also think it's playful. And part of the point of the book is to be playful, to say that this is a subject that's been treated with a lot of, certainly from the organized Jewish world, people talked about intermarriage as though it was like the worst thing since Hitler,
right.
Often even comparing it to Hitler. Right. So that wasn't the tone. And also a lot of books on intermarriage are awesome, but are really academic. And this book is meant to be a sort of lighthearted look at intermarriage, saying it doesn't have to be so hard. And the tagline for the book is more joy, less oi. And I try to sort of make that through the pages, that we can play here and we can have fun with it.
I guess, like, aside, like, when you put aside the question of the book itself, but just on the subject of intermarriage, I guess, I guess my question in part is, like, do you think that, compared to how people used to think about it, X years ago, that they were wrong, they were completely wrong back then, and they're wrong now? Or do you think sort of something has changed with regard to the place of Jews in in North America, in the world, where I mean, maybe there were more fears that were more legitimate back then, but now it's a different story? Or do you think like it always should have been a different story?
So I think yes and yes, in a way. I think that, in the book I talk about, I understand where some of the anxiety around intermarriage comes from. If you're an oppressed, marginalized group, and you fear the way other people will talk to you and treat you, then it kind of makes sense that you're like, I don't want, my loved ones to be in a relationship where they're always going to be looked down on. So I do understand that. And I still think it was wrong when you did have someone in your family say, this is the person I'm in love with, for them to treat it like it was the worst thing that ever happened. I certainly think it's wrong for parents to sit Shiva for their living children. I think, there are things that are wrong. And I understand where the anxiety comes from. Today, look, I mean, you can make the same argument now. Like, there's a rise in the expression of white supremacy. So I can see why people still are nervous. I also think intermarriage is a sign that we are widely accepted. It's nice that people love us and want to marry us. And, we should celebrate that as a sign of not our assimilation, but our acceptance. And I mean, the choice is to have a world in which we all live according to divisions, and we don't marry each other, and we don't go to school together, and we don't talk to each other, or to live in an open society where we celebrate diversity. And if that's the society you choose, there will be intermarriage of all kinds.
Right.
And you have to celebrate it. That's part of the deal of living in a diverse world, which I personally value as much as my Jewish heritage.
Right. I mean, I think the anxiety that a lot of people at least have has to do with what's going to be with the children, and then their children and their children and their children. And I remember I actually was impressed years ago. This is probably the only thing that I've agreed with Shmuley Boteach about. Rabbi Shmuley Boteach is a ultra-Orthodox rabbi who is kind of a character and is on a lot of press, does a lot of media. I guess we do too. But anyway, there was an article in the New York Times Magazine, I think, that Noah Feldman, who's a professor at Harvard, had written, where he thought that his Orthodox high school had kind of airbrushed him out of the reunion picture because he had intermarried. He was married to somebody who wasn't Jewish. And it turned out that I think there was a claim that hadn't actually happened, that it was just, there was a different picture chosen. Maybe that's why it was chosen, who knows? But he was writing this article, and that whole thing was in the news at that time. And Shmuley Boteach, who is actually an old friend of Noah's, as am I, he wrote something along the lines of, the problem with the way that you're treating Noah because he's intermarried is a problem in the sense that there is, as if the only thing to care about is the children, but Noah is himself a person, and Judaism cares about a person. And so he may have done one thing that you don't approve of, but vis-a-vis his children, you might say that is very, very bad, but vis-a-vis him, he still has, 612 other, commandments that he could do. And we should care about that. And we should not just sort of write him off, which I thought was an important point to note. But then also the question about the children, I guess my question about the children is that there's part of me that feels that if you define Judaism as fundamentally something that's passed from parent to child, then you can kind of understand a certain anxiety about intermarriage that says the odds go down that the child is going to be, engaged meaningfully in living a Jewish life if the parents are intermarried. It's certainly, the odds are much higher than people used to think they were, but probably a little bit lower, at least, than if both parents are Jewish. And you can understand the anxiety. Now, at the end of the day, I would say, but nevertheless, it's still the wrong thing to do all these terrible things like saying Kaddish and all that stuff. But the other question that is raised for me, and I think that one of the reasons why I was asking you, like, has something changed fundamentally now, is that I wonder whether we are sort of moving towards a new way in which Judaism is passed down. Meaning that at other times, at other major cataclysmic sort of times in Jewish history where Judaism itself has changed in a major way, who is a Jew has also changed. And so, in the Bible, Judaism is passed down purely patrilineally. it's not clear whether, there was no such thing as conversion. So it's not like the wife, converted to Judaism, but it was a patriarchal society where the women were always basically taking on the tribal and other identity of the man. So it was kind of a non-issue, but functionally it was considered paternal, patrilineal in its transmission. When Rabbinic Judaism started, for various reasons, some of which are known, some of which are hypothesized about, it flipped completely and became matrilineal. And so that's something that people ought to know. But now, if we really take seriously the idea that we may be at a time of a third era, which is what we talk about on Judaism Unbound all the time, and Yitz Greenberg talks about, then why wouldn't we imagine that a very similar change could happen? And I would say that if there is going to be a change of how Judaism is passed along, then the change would be that it's neither patrilineal nor matrilineal, but that it's purely by choice. And the question, and if it's purely by choice, then I think it would, among all the other reasons, then I think you should take a very different understanding of intermarriage, because it says, well, your child is not Jewish even if both parents are Jewish. Your child may be, in the same way that your child is not, we've talked about this on Judaism Unbound, in the same way your child is not a Democrat because both parents are Democrats, or your child is not a Republican because both parents are Republican. They may be more likely to become a Democrat or a Republican, because children tend to take on the parents' values. But if a Democrat marries a Republican, I don't think that people are saying, oh, you give faults, the child is going to be a Republican. They say hey, we better try to convince this child to become a Democrat. No, but I mean, they would say so our job is not to stop the marriage. Our job is to, try to, if we're the grandparents, we're Democrats. It's okay, well, we're going to try to, spend a lot of time with the kid so that he'll really love being a Democrat, and why don't, and it seems like that would be the attitude in a future version of Judaism, that, okay, so let's just, if we think Judaism is really great, let's just, make it a great experience for the kid, and maybe they'll just be Jewish.
Exactly. I mean, I think when we were talking about a couple generations ago, and even into the way I was raised, I think that so much of what Judaism was talking about how bad intermarriage is. Every time I attended a program, even a service, it would come up. Right. So nobody was showing us what was cool about Judaism. It was just saying you have to marry Jewish, but there was no why. Why? What am I passing down here? Am I gonna, I'm inheriting a somewhat empty container, and then you want me to pass that somewhat empty container on, but why? And I definitely think that Judaism is more of a choice now than it ever was. I'm not talking about Jews by choice in terms of those who become Jewish, who weren't born Jewish or raised Jewishly, but all of us choose how much to engage. And I certainly think, a few months ago, Tablet put out an article that the headline was something like "Boomers Wrecked Judaism." Not to be anti-boomer, but the article made the claim that a lot of boomers didn't pass on meaningful Judaism to their kids, but they did really reinforce how wrong intermarriage was. And so there was nothing meaningful for their kids to connect to. Their kids weren't Jewishly educated. They didn't celebrate holidays or do any Jewish practices in any kind of authentic way. But they knew it was wrong to intermarry. So it made Judaism seem really tribalistic and sort of kind of icky for a lot of people. So yeah, I mean, I think it has always been true that if you want the children of intermarriage to feel Jewish and do Jewish, you have to model it. And that's true for the children of people who are in married as well, right? If you're two Jews who don't do Judaism well, your kids are probably not going to do Judaism well either.
Right.
In the book, I say V is for values, right? So just like you're talking about with Democrat or Republican values, you have to enact those in your home. You can't just talk about them. You certainly can't talk about it never marry a Republican. That would be terrible, but never talk about what's good about being a Democrat. You got to do it. You got to show it. It has to be real. Same with Judaism. And I am not convinced. I know this is against mainstream thinking, but I'm not convinced that the children of intermarriage are less likely to identify with and practice Judaism. The more I see it, the more I feel like being in an intercultural partnership forces you to have serious discussions about what practices you want, what are your values, what do they look like. You have to teach them to your partner who didn't grow up with them. And that process creates some of that practice for the home. A lot of people who are intermarried feel it's much more important that they do instill the Jewish identity and values and practices. And a lot of people I see who are married to another Jew are like, well, we're Jewish. Like, we don't have to try.
Right.
And they never have those big conversations. So I feel strongly that intermarriage can actually produce children who are more likely to celebrate Judaism. And frankly, I think we have to be clear that, like, what is Judaism even? If your thing is attending synagogue on high holidays only, that could equally be, something children of intermarriage or not do.
Right.
But what's nice about the third era is there's so much creative stuff in Jewish life and so many cool ways to connect. So I think even more so now, it could branch off in interesting directions. And I no longer buy that the kids of married Jews are more likely to do that stuff. I think it could be the opposite.
Right, and it sort of raises this question of, like, ultimately this question of what is Judaism, or what are we even talking about? Because I think it's potentially that if you have an extremely tribal version of Judaism, where basically what Judaism means to you is some kind of people that I'm a part of, right, and it's almost completely genetic. Then right, there's no substance. There's a views for values. I mean, that's really where I'm going. It's that, like, so well, then first of all, like, why is that important at all? But like, I don't put it down. Like, I think it could be important in the same way that, like, why is it important that I'm a Libenson? I mean, my uncle, it's very, very important to him. He's always talking about, but like, why? Do the Libensons stand for something? Like, if they do, then it's important. But if it's just like some name, who cares? But some people care, and if you care, then I think that you will care about certain things, like like, it was important to my uncle when my son was born and that he got the name Libenson, and it wasn't as important to me. And actually, like, my wife and our children have two different last names because it just wasn't important to me. It was important to me that one of my kids had my last name. I mean, especially if one of them was going to have her last name. I mean, we could have had a different arrangement where we made up a name or something. It didn't even occur to us, I think. But anyway, like that if that's what you're really about, then I mean, you could look at it one way, and I could see the arguments going both ways. And I guess the thing at the end of the day is that a lot of people do sort of experience Judaism that way. They're like, well, that's kind of all it is. And actually, that goes back to Passover. I think that a lot of the reason why the COVID-19 was particularly devastating to people relating to Passover is because for a lot of people, Passover is primarily playing the same function as Thanksgiving, in the sense that it's a time for family gathering, and that's it. Do we do a little bit of reading of the Haggadah? Yeah, but like, it's not really, the emphasis. So the fact that we can't get together as family is devastating. Whereas for me, it was not that at all. It was actually, like, for me, it's always like, how do we make the Passover experience more transformational? So I was like, if we can do that better on Zoom, then that's fine. So anyway, that's one piece of it. But I think that when we talk about the other possibility, right, which is that Judaism really stands for something, then it just sort of seems like, first of all, anybody at that point, anybody who wants to be a Jew, great. Like, in the same way that if I'm running the Democratic Party, I want anybody to become a Democrat, because, like, the more people, the more power we have, right? The more people, the more good values we're going to have. So it's kind of like, so instead of trying to, sort of sit shiva for people who haven't even gone out the door, it's just that we've defined them as having gone out the door. You would do the opposite. You would say, like, let's celebrate the fact that maybe their spouse is going to be added, in some way to our values. So that's kind of where I think it's actually like a connection to this week's Torah portion that maybe we could talk about a little bit, and maybe come back and forth through these topics. But we jumped the gun a little bit last week, where we talked about, I was excited because it was my bar mitzvah portion, but actually, because it was Passover, there was a extra Torah reading just for Passover. So we jumped the gun a little bit talking about this Torah portion called Shmini, which is actually this week's Torah portion, not the last week's. That said, we are secular Jews, so I'm not sure how tied we are to the official order of the Torah portions. But in any event, one of the topics in this Torah portion that we didn't talk about too much last week was kosher food. And, basically it talks about which animals are kosher. And I think that's something that I think bears some conversation in light of what we've been talking about, in that I feel like, our impulses, and I don't mean your and my impulse, but I mean generally people's impulse when they say, well, I'm a secular Jew, or I'm not a believer, is that, well, then I don't have to keep kosher. Of course I don't have to keep kosher. I don't believe, right? And yet I think that there's something deep in the idea of keeping kosher that is actually a lot of secular Jews, for example, do in the form of that they're vegan or vegetarian, right? That they actually have this strongly held food-based limitations rules, right? And the only difference between calling that a form of keeping kosher or not is how much deference are you giving to these specific rules or to these specific rabbinic interpreters. So that's why I'm trying to say that I think kind of what I define as keeping kosher is actually not only a very important and powerful value, but it's actually one that is shared by a huge number of secular people. And why are we insisting on defining it in a certain way that makes people feel like they're bad Jews or not keeping kosher when actually they are? Something like that, I thought was something to talk about.
And it might, in fact, be more ethical to do it in a more contemporary way.
Right.
So, I mean, that's a challenge. I think we talked before about whether you follow the intention or, the letter of the law. And the truth is, it's much more ethical to be vegan than to eat kosher meat. It is, according to any scientific standard. And so I would say that it's agreeing and disagreeing with you, because I would say, I wouldn't say I keep kosher. I would say I eat ethically for today's standard, and that's better than kosher. Some people talk about keeping kosher as a way of reminding yourself you're Jewish every day, because every time you eat, you're doing it in a Jewish way. And if you're vegan, that may not be the case. But in terms of the Torah portion is about, what's clean and not clean eating, about hygiene, and I think animal cruelty, and, the spirit of that description is, I think, that we have to eat lower on the food chain.
Right. But why not call that, why not as a secular Jewish community or as a secular Jewish people, why not insist that we're going to redefine what keeping kosher means, and that we're going to say, you're reading the Torah the wrong way, Mr. Traditional Jew. You're reading the Torah in this very linear way to say, what the Torah is saying is eat animals that chew their cud and have cloven hooves, as opposed to taking it up a level of abstraction and saying, what the Torah says here, for example, is eat animals that are not predators. And that what that really stands for is that we should try not to be predators. And in the world of the Bible, they had to eat meat, in order to have enough protein, but we don't anymore. And so the way that we should understand these rules is that we should not be predators, meaning we should become vegan or vegetarian, right? And now, so first of all, you could make that reading, you can do that sort of logical reasoning version of which I just did. Now, then the question is, as secular Jews, should we bother? And I think that I would assert yes, right? Meaning that I would assert that it is something more powerful to say that we are carrying on a tradition of our people that has been around for thousands of years, and the tradition always was, let's eat lower on the food chain. Let's be as little of a predator as we can. And what's changed is that now, and it's not because God commanded it, it's because our people have had this value from the very beginning, in the same way that nobody says, hey, we shouldn't love the strangers because we're secular, even though the Torah says a million times, love the stranger. So just because we're secular and the Torah says, eat low in the food chain, doesn't mean I can't say that I'm doing that for a Jewish reason. That's my question, is why haven't, that's actually where I think that there's a real, where I would be, our topic is called Daring Judaism. And I feel like there's part of me that wants to dare secular Judaism, to be more comfortable saying yeah, we are doing what has been the tradition of our people. And it's not just that we enjoy, Jewish culture in the sense of like art and music. We actually enjoy Jewish values. And I don't know. So that, like, how does that land on you?
Yeah, I love that. I especially love the part where we say we are doing kosher, and in a sense, we're doing it better, because one of the things that I strongly object to in Jewish spaces, non-denominational ones, is when kosher is the default. And that can mean using a ton of disposable dishes and cutlery. And I'm like, that's not ethical. It would be more ethical to say, if you're kosher, bring your own, compostable plate, but we're using real dishes here because that's more ethical. And I don't like kosher, traditionally kosher as default. So I would love it if we said, as a wide, big tent community, we're redefining kosher to be as ethical as possible.
Right.
One challenge, this came up, I think I'm allowed to tell you, at the Association of Humanistic Rabbis last summer. Someone suggested we write a position statement about how eating vegetarian would be kind of our secular version of kosher, and we encourage people to do so. And most of the rabbis were like, we can't tell people what to eat. That's so against, so many people who identify as secular humanistic Jews value the autonomy of being able to choose for ourselves, and they don't want to be told what to eat. So that's a challenge. But I do encourage people to consider it.
Right. But like that, let's go to that, because I was thinking about that before we came on. Like I was thinking about how to sort of talk about what secular Judaism really is, which is like, I feel like I understand what the secular humanistic movement says, which are some certain things, like, for example, because these were Sherwin Wine's positions, who was the founder, and so there's at least of humanistic Judaism. So there's certain things that are kind of like carried on in the tradition of a particular movement. So I don't necessarily want to at least limit myself to the secular humanistic movement, which, by the way, like, I'm not a part of. But I very firmly define myself as a secular Jew. And part of the reason why I'm not a part of it, I would say, is because I am looking for a movement that has rules and regulations. Now, I don't mean that in an authoritative way. Like, I don't want some authority figure. I'm not looking for a rabbi to tell me what the rules are, but I'm thinking about it sort of like a sports league, or, right? Like, if you want to play baseball, there's a certain way to play baseball. And if you want to play chess, there's a certain way to play chess. So if you want to play Judaism, like, I'm not uncomfortable in principle with the idea that there's a certain way to play Judaism. Now, and just because, right, everybody who plays, and I mean, well, a lot of people who play those sports are actually very like religious Christians, but like, I'm saying that a lot of people like are secular that play these sports, and I don't hear any objections. I don't hear anybody saying it should be a big free for all, where we can't, suggest that there are certain principles that are, constitutive of what this is. And that's what I'm trying to kind of dig around for here. And like, why can't we say in a more strong way, kashrut is a part of our people's tradition for the last 3,000 years, and this is how we're defining it. I've lost Denise, or she might have frozen. So I'm going to just talk for a little while until we see if she returns. Anyway, so that was, so I think she may be trying to come back on. And I will just continue to say that I think that at least one of the things that I'm thinking about, oh, here she comes.
Sorry.
That's right. I don't know how much you heard of what I was saying at the end.
Baseball team, community norms.
I mean, my point was just like, I don't hear a lot of people saying that, even like they're secular, so there shouldn't be any rules for baseball. Like, so why, that's where I'm just like, why is that not okay? Or, yeah, I mean, that's where I'm.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. I think about that a lot. I think a couple of weeks ago, I think we were talking about the question of obligation and community. And I've been thinking about that all the time. I do think, if we're going to be serious about having community and identity, part of it is about, like, to be on a team, any kind of team, there are norms, there are rules to follow, there are practices that are considered kosher and not kosher. That's part of the deal. And if you want to be part of the team, you follow along. And Judaism, certainly in terms of Jewish law, like has those. But even without that, I definitely think there was a sense that you had to participate in certain things to be part of the team. That included going to services, that included membership somewhere, that included paying for it, that included doing stuff a lot in your house and hanging out with people who were part of that team. All of that was part of it. And now for a lot of people, none of that is part of it. And the challenge I have is that I'm okay with some of that. Like, I don't think you have to go to services all the time and only hang out with Jewish people to be part of the team.
Right.
But it does come at the cost of it being very hard to regulate those rules. Even as you were talking about it, you're like,
right.
I want the structure, I want the rules, but I don't want a rabbi to tell me what to do.
Right.
Like, that's, you
right.
kind of can't have one without the other.
I don't know. I mean, like, you admit that may or may not be true. I think it's a question. Like, are there ways to create a community that has, some kind of policing of norms that are, where the norms are suggested, meaning like nobody is punished for not keeping, we're now redefining kosher as vegetarian, let's say.
Sure.
And nobody is punished for not being a vegetarian, but we also feel comfortable saying that that part of what it means to be in this club is to take seriously the idea that our food choices matter. Our food choices matter in terms of ethics, of caring for animals, of how laborers are treated. Our ethics matter in terms of global warming, the climate. I was moved really much by reading Jonathan Safran Foer's book, Eating Animals, where he really focused more on the climate change that's coming from eating animals than from the cruelty to animals. And maybe that says something about me, but I was more swayed by that, actually.
Well, I definitely think, just to say, I do think in my communities anyway, both the Toronto community, we did a Green Shabbat program, and I did feel comfortable saying, I think if you want to take seriously the Jewish values we hold dear, we should consider being vegetarian. And in secular synagogue, we talk about it quite a lot. I would also say, just given our current moment, and you brought up the issue of climate change, I think it's also related to pandemics. The pandemics we have come from the way people engage with eating animals,
right.
Whether that's factory farming, which I would love if the thing that came out of this was that we no longer allowed factory farming, and the eating of, strange animals and stuff without regulation also is bad. But I think it's totally about human health, about, climate, and about cruelty to animals. And those were the concerns of the writers of the Bible as well.
Right. So let's go back to the Torah portion. Like, what else was in that portion that you think is important to raise?
There are so many things. So it's such an interesting portion. Good one for a bar mitzvah.
Did I say last week that I was supposed to have the following week, but my mom wouldn't allow it because it was all about like bodily emissions and stuff.
So good. So we'll have it. You can, next week you get to talk about it. So you
get
to do,
right. The
do
bar Torah I never got to give.
Yeah. Exactly. But this one talks about, one thing that's so interesting in it is that they build the tabernacle 7 times, take it down. They're all practice times. And then the 8th time is supposed to stick. So Shmini means 8. So what an interesting idea. Like, can you imagine anything that you build, whether that's a website and you're working on a website or anything having to do with like 7 times is practice, take it down. And then the 8th time is supposed to stick. It's such an interesting idea about creating anything really, but particularly a sacred space, and how the Torah is telling us, like, you're not going to get it right the first time. So it's totally about experimentation, which really connects with so much of what we talk about here and what you and Lex talk about on Judaism Unbound, related to how this is a time of experimentation in terms of the metaphorical tabernacles or sacred spaces or Jewish spaces that people are creating. So I love that. And the other thing I like is that this parsha talks about a wellspring. So this idea that there's some body of water that can contribute to holiness and wellness. And it's the origin of the idea of the mikvah, a ritual bath, which is something I can talk about for a long time. So you take it however you want.
No, the one thing, I think I mentioned this also last week, I've been thinking about this a lot, but just to put it into context, is that I think the book of Leviticus, I've taken a new interest in it, because because I think that, you know, if we've just undergone this crazy upheaval with coronavirus, and I think it really bears analogy to the exodus from Egypt and to the destruction of the Second Temple, in the sense that there's this sudden, you know, the way we had it before suddenly is gone. And here we are in this strange situation, this strange environment. In our case, it's actually like a new land of the internet. And we don't know what to do. And we can try to sort of do it the old way. And there's some indication that maybe there's a new way on the horizon. And I think that the book of Leviticus is kind of telling us, in the myth or in the story of that time, like, okay, this was the new Judaism that was being announced, you know, or was being experimented with. And so it's really analogous to our time. And so then I think we can do direct analogy and say, well, then what would the keeping kosher be of the third era or the internet age or whatever? But we can also do it just by a less direct comparison and just say, well, these are the things that are saying, like, these are the new practices that are kind of, and they're like, some of them are kind of connected to something that had come before, but some of them are not, and they're just totally new, and maybe they come from other peoples that were living in the wilderness, and who knows. So I think that the whole framing, and I think these particular, right, so if I'm getting this right, like this portion tells us at least 4 new ideas, I think, right? One is the keeping kosher. 2 is the idea of a wellspring or a purification through water, and that becomes a mikvah. The third is this idea of you know, experimenting 7 times until you get it right, you know, and not thinking that the first implementation is the right implementation, which is critically important for this new time, you know, that people shouldn't get wedded to their ideas too quickly. And then the fourth thing is what we talked about a little bit last week, which was this idea that Aaron's sons were punished were killed for bringing this strange fire into the tabernacle, which I suggested last week. Maybe the strangeness of the fire was that it actually wasn't strange. It was that it had come from, that they were trying to do the previous version of Judaism in the new place, you know, and that was what was problematic. But it's like a fascinating portion in terms of thinking about, like, okay, these are some of the new rules and the new, so let's talk about it a little bit in that context, and let's talk about the mikvah, because I know that that's something that you think about a lot, and for somebody, again, who's a secular Jew, I think it's interesting to know that you think about a mikvah, and I'd love to know more about what you think about it.
So I'll tell you, I got to tell you a couple stories to really like get at what I think about the mikvah. One is that when I was about 14, I was really into exploring Judaism and like becoming more serious about Judaism. And I went on a trip with Chabad to Crown Heights in Brooklyn, and they showed us all the stuff. And my main takeaways were both that like I was super interested in Judaism and I loved it, but also that like the traditional forms of it were way too sexist. And one of those experiences was because they took us to a mikvah. It was the first time I had heard of a mikvah. And it was they described it as like, well, because you're unclean as a woman, you have to do this. And I was like, whoa. And then, so I never considered going to the mikvah. And then I read Rabbi Elise Goldstein's Taking Back the Waters, which she talks about, you know, as feminists reclaiming the space and how could we make it a feminist space. I was like, oh, that's interesting. But it was sort of more theoretically interesting to me. Like I had no intention of actually going to a mikvah as a secular Jew. And then all these cool mikvahs opened up. There's Maimheim in Boston and Immerse NYC. And even in Toronto, it's run by the Reform rabbis, but they have a very inclusive mikvah where you can go and you don't have to say traditional prayers. You can say whatever you want and create an experience for you. And I, again, never thought I would. But then after, like, this is sharing something personal, but after experiencing pregnancy loss, I really was looking for ways to ritualize it. And one of those ways for me was going to the mikvah. And I created a secular mikvah immersion experience to try to let that go. And it was transformative for me and I loved it. And then I became a doula. And so I create mikvah ceremonies for people a lot where I'm like, do it however you want. You don't have to go to a community mikvah, do it in a lake, do it like, you know, if you don't care about the rules, you can be creative. But the idea of water as purifying, I still think is powerful. A lot of religions and cultures have it. And why not as secular Jews make it our own?
But can you like talk a little bit about, like, if you don't believe in the supernatural, and you also know that, I mean, it's one thing to say like, when we wash our hands, like we're actually washing some dirt off or some bacteria or whatever. And I actually thought like this Passover was very interesting in terms of the hand washing situation, you know, and also to realize that back then probably the hand washing was quite necessary, you know, for before you eat a meal. But like with a mikvah, you're not actually dirty. You're sort of spiritually trying to remove something, or right, you know. But if you don't believe in the supernatural dimension of that, then like how do you find a spiritual meaning in it when you kind of know intellectually that nothing really is happening? Yeah, right.
Yeah, there was no part of me that felt, you know, any supernatural force was cleansing me. But I am a believer in ritual and its power. So it is a powerful ritual for those who've never experienced the mikvah. First of all, traditionally, it was completely gender segregated, which I know doesn't work for some non-binary and trans folks. But because I was dealing with pregnancy loss, being in a space that was for women sort of felt healing in a sense. And the process when you attend a mikvah, anyone of any gender, is that you go through this whole sort of cleansing. You're supposed to really like make sure there's no dirt under your fingernails and clean every part of your body. And I think a ritual that involves the body is particularly powerful. And then you go in naked, so you do sort of feel vulnerable in a certain way. And you know, it's a space that people use to feel purified or to let stuff go or to heal. And so the fact that you have that community connection and it's embodied and it's a long-standing ritual, all of those I think make it very powerful.
And it's interesting because like when you think about, like, let's say that the practice of mikveh never existed from traditional Judaism, you know, traditional believing Judaism. The question is like if secular people wanted to create some kind of ritual or some kind of something that they would use in times like this, for their pregnancy loss. I mean, I think it's interesting that you know, a lot of people have been using it, as I understand, the Mayim Chayim mikveh in Boston as like after finishing chemotherapy, like that they go through some kind of rebirth, basically. And you can imagine that maybe they would have come up with this because there is this idea of rebirth, right? Of going into waters and emerging from waters, and it's sort of like a birth. So you could sort of, and the truth is that that probably is the origin in some even like pre-religion, you know, that there was some kind of, granted they were still thinking about supernatural things, but like in some sort of mythic, not God-centered religion like the way that we think of it today, that's the origin of a lot of these rituals that then became taken over by Judaism, Christianity. I mean, it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, the question of cultural appropriation, you know, or other versions of calling that borrowing, you know, that these rituals that came from, you know, various forms of pre-religious societies were then taken by religion and maybe even tamed, you know, but certainly adapted and adopted. And then the question is like, okay, what do we do in, let's say, a post-religious society? And the question, the way that I'm trying to like struggle with it is saying like, realistically though, we generally in our time don't invent new rituals of this nature because somehow they don't seem true to our post-enlightenment rational way of thinking. And yet, just like you're describing, they're extremely powerful. So you know, there was a book by Alan de Botton about that it was called Religion for Atheists, and you know, he was trying to really go through this and say, you know, well, are there other things that we can draw from religion and find secular manifestations of them that are still powerful? And you know, I think what I'm struggling with is this question of if we can adapt them from religion. First of all, we should. And so the first thing that I'm saying, going back to the kashrut thing that I was talking about earlier, is that we should not, in my opinion, be throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And that, you know, and I've said this about Israel before, that I think one of the tragedies of Israel is that the founders of Israel secularized the Hebrew language that had been a religious language for thousands of years before. They secularized the land, mostly, at least initially, and but they didn't secularize the religion, mostly. They mostly threw it out. And because of that, I think that Israel is on a sort of shaky cultural foundation, and that actually contributes to a lot of the problems in Israeli society that we see today. And if we can see that in Israel, then I would say, let's look at ourselves in North America. And I think we would see the same things. And maybe even like we didn't really secularize the language either, but I mean that we didn't really secularize the religion. In part in North America, that's because it was a religion, at least the United States is a religious country. And so there was more an effort to, let's say, dial down the religion rather than secularize it. So as a result, there isn't this tradition of like mining the religious material of Judaism to create powerful new secular rituals. And instead, those of us who define ourselves as secular have largely been assumed, at least by others, to be saying that we're not interested in that stuff. We're just trying to, have bagels. And not that there's anything wrong with that, and so anyway, so again, I'm kind of like, in terms of daring, I mean, I think that I'm daring secular Jews to go back to that well, so to speak, and to really say, like, can we take something as alien seeming as mikvah, as sort of almost like primitive seeming as what you think that you're going to go in a water and somehow that's going to, and to say, well, if we can make that a powerful secular ritual, which has been done in our day, then what about everything else? And then the other daring, though, then it becomes, and I dare you, more those who claim that they're carrying on the tradition to recognize that as also valid, right? As also powerful. And that's that. I think that's the objective that all Judaism Unbound has been about. It's really about saying, can we create some kind of movement? And I don't mean like a movement with a, all the accoutrements of it. I mean, like, can we like move people to say, hey, we're doing that. We're involved in it. I mean, that's why I love Tiffany Schleyen's book recently, 24/6, where she's creating a tech Shabbat, where she actually, when I say to her, you're so religious about this, by which I mean that she's very strict with all her rules and regulations, she takes offense because she's like, I'm not religious. I'm like, no, that's not what I meant. I meant that, like, you're so serious. You have rules, and
rules.
So, and that goes back, I guess, to what I was saying about the rules, right? I want the secular, movement, the actual, the secular humanistic movement. I want there to be some more rules. I know that that's kind of against what the movement is about, which is part of why I don't connect to it,
Well, I mean, we have things like, I mean, I would say what you're describing is what the movement of humanistic Judaism did, and also secular Jewish institutions, was to mine the religion and say, how do we adapt? So there's a lot of stuff out there. People don't have to feel like they have to reinvent the wheel entirely. And I also think that there's more to do, and there's certainly more to do in our individual lives. So just because, we're doing the weekly Torah portion in our discussion, when I was doing rabbinical school, that was my rabbinic thesis, to talk about the weekly Torah portion. And I would typically study it on Shabbat. And it was a way of me doing that traditional thing, but I didn't do it in synagogue. I did it on my own or in a library, which for me is more of a sanctuary than just about anywhere, because I love books. And so it was a way of saying, like, I'm going to do this my way, but it's still totally in conversation with the way it has always been done, and also the way people are doing it now everywhere.
Yeah, well, I think it'll be interesting to continue to go through. I mean, I'm excited now to go through. So next week's Torah portion, Tazria Metzora, is
leprosy.
What?
It's the leprosy one.
It's a leprosy and all kinds of emissions. And I think it'll be interesting to see what we make of it from a secular perspective, because I wanna, I guess, challenge us to read that with new eyes, and folks who are watching this and want to prepare. I mean, I would say read these portions in a way. It's like, if you can make these portions make sense from a secular perspective, then everything can make sense from a secular perspective. But but the other question is, like, even if we're not specifically interpreting like what are leprosy and emissions all about, I do think it's worth asking, like, what are some new practices in our post-COVID time? Some of them are purity related, right? I mean, people are saying, I'm never going to shake hands with anybody again.
I know.
Of them, right? What's that going to look like? I mean, we have things like mute yourself when you come into a Zoom room, right? I mean, there are all kinds of like rituals that are new to us. And I think it's an interesting lens to look at this stuff through. So,
yeah.
So I guess I will say at the last thing is that, you know, your book, like you were saying, that you it's hard to sell a new book in this kind of situation, but you can get the A to Z of Intermarriage by Denise Handlarski on Amazon and wherever books are sold, in either stores where you can go in masked and gloved, or on the internet. There's all kinds of independent bookseller sites,
Yeah.
and Amazon and anything. And it's really a wonderful book. It has a very fantastic blurb on the back by me, and you know, it's really one of those books that I hope, you know, everybody will own. I mean, like one of the questions is, like, sometimes it's some I've talked to other folks who've released books recently, or even just before COVID, and it was a Jewish book, and it's hard to sell books to a niche audience of any kind. But there's certain books that are going to last for decades, I think, you know, and I think that Sarah Hurwitz's book Here All Along is an incredible introduction to Judaism that I think will be the fundamental text for decades. And I think that this also is going to be a fundamental text on the bookshelf of all Jews for decades. So if it sells slowly now, I think it's going to be one that kind of keeps selling. So but I would encourage everybody to take a look at it, because it's great.
Thank you.
So let's so we'll be here this time next week, and
Indeed. Thanks so much.